and with Columbus, and that's why I start with that date and with him. It was the time when the last Islamic state in Iberia fell to the Catholic Reconquista. Multiculturalism in Spain ended, and tolerance for Jews was destroyed in that region. In fact, writes the historian David Stannard, and I quote, "On the very day that Columbus finally set forth on his journey that would shake the world, the port of the city he sailed from was filled with ships that were deporting Jews from Spain. By the time the expulsion was complete, between 120,000 and 150,000 Jews had been driven from their homes." These events back in Spain were a portent of much worse to come, both in the Americas and in Africa. What was triggered there on these two continents by Columbus's so-called discovery was the largest demographic catastrophe in human history. In his 1993 book, The Conquest of America, this is the book, should be translated into German, a follow-up to his 1976 book, Columbus, His Enterprise, the late Dutch-American author Hans Koning describes Columbus as a false hero who was nevertheless turned into a kind of founder hero of the New World, the symbol of white civilization bringing light to a dark continent. As a person enshrouded in a myth that many people feel difficult to let go. Conscious of how difficult it is really to face the awful truth, he appeals to his readers. Those of you who had trouble with Columbus's Enterprise will have even more trouble with this sequel. But I'm dealing with facts. Please give them a chance. Let's now turn to the particular set of facts I'm intending to give you here. The number of people who lived in the Americas on that fateful day when Columbus landed cannot be safely established, but a considerable amount of historical research has led historians to move from a figure as low as 8.4 million, 1 million of them in North America, to figures as high as 145 million in all of America, with 18 million north of Mexico. One of the foremost experts in the field, David Stannard, who I already quoted, writes in his book, American Holocaust, The Conquest of the New World, that today few serious students of the subject would put the hemispheric figure at less than 75 million to 100 million, with approximately 8 million to 12 million north of Mexico. In what follows, I will assume a somewhat arbitrarily low estimate taken from yet another classic in the field, Russell Thornton's 1987 book, American Indian Holocaust and Survival, A Population History. And summarizing the state of research in the mid-1980s, he reaches an estimate of 72 million, with 7 million people north of the Rio Grande. This conservative number offers us the advantage to make a comparison, and that's here. What you see is 7 million in North America, 75 million in South America, approximately the same number as in Europe at that time, largest continent as today is Asia, Oceania with 1.5 million, and 55 million in Africa. And these two continents, geographically more than half of the world, as you can see on this map, were basically depopulated in the years, in the 200 to 300 years that came after that. Even Columbus himself made a personal contribution to this demographic catastrophe. After his return to Spain from his first voyage in 1493, he set sail again in that same year and became the governor of an island he called Hispaniola, for obvious reasons. The island that today consists of the Dominican Republic and Haiti from 1493 to 1500. When he first landed there, he wrote to the Spanish court that Hispaniola is a miracle, both fertile and beautiful. The inhabitants are so tractable, so peaceable, astonishingly shy. They are so free with their possessions. When you ask for something, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. They are of great intelligence. But he also ominously added, if your majesties so wish, all can be carried to Spain or made slaves on their island. This is Hispaniola before the conquest. These, by the way, were the last positive words that Columbus had to say about the people who then came to be called Indians. Hans Koning, who quotes all this, comments, this was the first and last time that Columbus would write admiringly of the local people. From then on, they were savages. The problem for the people on the island baptized Hispaniola was that Columbus had promised the Spanish crown gold, a lot of gold, and that only a trickle of the expected amounts were found after he landed after his second voyage. The Indians there were not abducted to Spain, but enslaved right then and there, and they were treated with extraordinary brutality. Based on the reports of Bartolomeo de las Casas, a friar who had at first gone along with Columbus's project, but then turned into a furious opponent of Spanish colonialism and its cruelties, Koning describes the practices of Columbus's regime in the following way. Columbus had promised mountains of gold to his king and queen, and his obsessive need to fulfill the promise led to the death of half the population during his rule. At least 500,000 people died, perhaps more. The Indians were sent to collect gold from the streams and to bring it to the Spanish fort. Those who met their quota, a tiny bell of full gold dust every 3 months, were given a kind of dog tag to hang around their necks. Those who were found without such a tag had their hands cut off. Those who fled into the mountains were hunted with dogs. The chiefs or caciques were burned alive to quench any taste for rebellion. They were hanged in rows of 13 above fires of green wood. Why 13? That was in honor of the Redeemer and his 12 apostles. Thus Columbus himself set into operation something what is perhaps best described in the phrase of the author of the book on the plundering of Africa in this and the last century, Tom Burgess, as the looting machine. And a looting machine of unspeakable cruelty at that. The population of Hispaniola at the time of Columbus's arrival has been estimated at various amounts. Today, the estimate is 8 million. What happened to them? They suffered the same fate as all of the population in the Caribbean, geographically within what came to be called the Spanish Main. The Spanish Main is the mainland of the Americas surrounding the Caribbean. As David Stannard writes, Just 21 years after Columbus's first landing in the Caribbean, the vastly populous island that the explorer had renamed Hispaniola was effectively desolate. Nearly 8 million people, who Columbus chose to call Indian, had been killed by violence, disease, and despair. While Columbus was a cruel but relatively ineffectual looter, the latter an aspect that contributed to his eventual fall from grace, it is well known that other looters were much more successful. Hernando Cortés and Francisco Pizarro successfully plundered Mexico and Peru, and the Spanish and simultaneously Portuguese conquest and domination of South America went on from there. And here comes the reason into play why the absolute numbers of the population of the Western Hemisphere at the time of Columbus's arrival is not even all that crucial to grasp the cataclysm that befell the peoples, tribes, and nations that lived there. Among those authors, there is much unity about the extent or percentage of the decline that happened in the 400 years between 1492 and 1892. In his book, Russell Thornton writes, I estimated a total population of 72+ million American Indians in the Western Hemisphere at Columbus's arrival. This 72+ million declined in a few centuries to perhaps only about 4 to 4.5 million. This was a population about 6% its former size. It represents a tremendous population decline over the centuries. David Sternhardt, in his book, American Holocaust, writes, within no more than a handful of generations following their first encounter with Europeans, the vast majority of Western Hemisphere's native people had been exterminated. The pace and magnitude of their obliteration varied from place to place and from time to time, but for years now historical demographers have been uncovering in region upon region post-Columbian depopulation rates of between 90 and 98%, with such regularity that an overall decline of 95% has become a working rule of the thumb. So this is the overall number. You can project that to double the size. The percentages, the relative decline doesn't change. Before we turn to what happened on the current territory of the United States, I think two remarks need to be made lest the historical perspective is distorted. Because it's often remarked, particularly by mainstream authors, that the vast majority of the people who died in the Americas as a result of their contact with the European conquerors died from diseases, not from direct violence. In my research, I was not able to find any direct estimate of the ratio, one reason being that the ratio could vary enormously. Sometimes whole populations would disappear from illnesses without any violence applied to them, and sometimes they were subjected to rabid genocide and were killed down to the last man and child by violence. Actually, in a curious way, the European conquerors reminded one of King Midas in the Greek mythology, who turned everything into gold by merely touching it, only to discover that you cannot eat gold. The Europeans who invaded the Americas in ever greater number could not fail to note that everywhere they went, they brought death and destruction with them. It is quite obvious, though, that they rarely, if ever, did much to try to help that the people they had, at first at least unwittingly, turned to their victims. And often, particularly in North America, they saw the destruction of the Indians there by a whole variety of diseases as a God-given and welcome event that made room for them to settle the land they desired. Both the books already cited and Ben Kierman's relevant chapters in his study on genocides give a number of quotes to that effect. My own guess would be that the ratio is approximately 10% violence and 90% diseases, destruction of traditional ways of life, the alcoholism that was served by the Congress, and so on and so forth. Even so, David Stannard's remark in the introduction to his book seems quite appropriate. From almost the instant of first human contact between Europe and the American firestorms of microbiological pestilence and purposeful genocide began laying waste the American natives. Although at times operating independently, for most of the long centuries of devastation that followed 1492, disease and genocide were interdependent forces acting dynamically, whipsawing their victims between plagues and violence, each one feeding upon the other, and together driving countless numbers of entire ancient societies to the brink, and often over the brink, of total extermination. The second remark on historical perspective: the destruction of the native population, brought about by the desire for riches and land, first in the Caribbean, then in the Spanish Main, then onwards in South America and later on to North America, was so extreme that it set into operation a second looting machine. This time a looting machine that did not steal and plunder raw materials and land, but human beings. Research summarized by David Leonard seems to suggest that 12 to 15 million slaves captured in Africa survived. First, what in effect were death marches from the interior of Africa to the western coast, then the transport on the slave ships, and finally another highly destructive process of being seasoned, sold and set to work in the Americas themselves. The estimates Stannard gives for the respective death toll are 50% for the death marches, 10% for the transport across the Atlantic, and another 50% for those that survived that transport. And projecting backwards from the number of survivors, he reaches a number of anywhere between 36 million and 60 million Africans who did not survive the slave trade that went on mainly between the early 16th and the early 19th century, operated mainly by the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch. In the late 1980s, Toni Morrison published her famous book, Beloved, on African American slavery. And it was preceded by the not even sentence, the phrase 60 million and more. And she was viciously attacked by that, for that constituted some sort of denial of the European Holocaust of the Jews and so on and so forth. Numbers vastly exaggerated, 60 million, how can she talk about 60 million dead Africans? But it turns out that what Morrison did before she wrote her novel, she did some serious historical research with the most modern and the best sources. And what you find, for example, if you go to the much praised Wikipedia, you still find numbers about the African slave trade that are just ridiculously low. And the same is true of much academic work, I'm sorry to have to say. Let us now finally take a closer look at what happened in today's US, because it happens to be embedded in this much larger story. There's the title of a book that I couldn't find in the University of Heidelberg, and there seem to exist only 5 copies in the whole library system in Germany, and that's Henry Dobbins' Their Number Becomes End. That's a milestone apparently in historical research on the real numbers of the people that perished. So, for one thing, their number became thinned. And for another thing, in Russell Thornton's book, which I have already quoted a couple of times, you find a graph that really speaks all for itself. This is the population history of the Native Americans on the territory of today's United States, assuming that the population was as low as 5 million in 1492, which was probably not. It's probably closer to 10 million or 12 million or something like that. Now, if we take a closer look at the graph that you see on the screen, we must ask, where does the drastic population decline in the years up to 1600 come from? Cutting the assumed population of 5 million almost in half. The answer is the Spanish Main. The Spanish had not just invaded the Caribbean, but also the mainland, and the brutality, violence, and pestilence they brought with them. Spanish marauders, slave hunters, and plunderers had come as far north as Florida and southern Georgia, and there, according to Leonard, for every 10 Timucuan Indians who were alive in 1515, only one was alive in 1607, within the space of 95 years. And by 1607, a short decade later, that number was halved again. According to the most detailed population analysis of this region that has ever been done, in 1520 the number of Timucuan people in the area totaled over 720,000. Following a century of European contact, they numbered barely 60,000. 2/3 of a million native people, 95% of the enormous and ancient Timucuan society had been obliterated by the violence of sword and plague. This is even without counting California at the time, which was also under Spanish domination. To this must be added another fact, namely that the newly European diseases often spread like wildfire among the Native Americans themselves. That is, the European conquerors didn't even have to come into direct contact with the natives. The natives spread it among themselves and created a double and triple and quadruple effect. So we can divide the demographic cataclysm of the Native Americans in today's US into 3 periods. First, from the beginning of the 16th century to the beginning of the 17th century, where the contact with and the violence by the Spanish was mainly responsible. Second, a period that roughly begins with the first real English colony in Jamestown, Virginia, which later on gave rise to unspeakable Pocahontas stories. Monica Seiler will be talking about this in the afternoon, and which reaches until 1776, the period of British rule. And third, the period of US rule from 1776 to roughly the turn of the 20th century, when the Native American population had reached its absolutely low. I have briefly talked about the catastrophic effect of the Spanish period. The 170 years or so under the influence of the British brought more havoc. Russell Thornton writes, the 5 million plus American Indians in the coterminous United States area, estimated in chapter 2, had declined to but 600,000 by 1800. The first date for which we have reasonably good population data on American Indians in the United States. That's all the more remarkable since the original United States. By the way, we have a counter curve. This is the population decline curve of Native Americans in the territory of today's US. And this is the non-Indian population growth in the United States area from 1492 to 1980. So you can see how these curves closely fit together. One is the Gegenstück of the other.
Does that count other minorities?
This even includes Black Americans. This just excludes Native Americans. This is the Spanish Main. This is where the Spanish operated their empire until it collapsed, and where they marauded and depopulated North America to the tune of at least 2.5 million Native Americans. And what happened, what I just described, the decline from 2.5 million to 600,000, is all the more remarkable since it happened during a time when what was later to become the US was only on this small fraction of territory, which was basically ethnically cleansed from all Native Americans up to the river of Missouri, and which was also the place of many little genocides of smaller tribes and nations. I will not describe in detail, and I'm about to come to an end, I will not describe in detail how all these battles went. So-called battles, more often massacres than battles, but will note an important characteristic here that distinguished the Spanish colonial rule from British one. In the beginning, at least, the Spanish enterprise cannot aptly be described as settler colonialism, because Cortes, Pizarro, and other such men terrorized their victims with just a few hundred men, who relied on their superior weapons. And even by the end of the 16th century, after 100 years of brutal conquest, only perhaps 200,000 Spaniards had moved their lives to the Indies, to Mexico, to Central America, and points further to the south, writes David Stannard. In the US, the relatively small area of the new country in 1776, when the state was founded, was already home to 2.5 million people, with the natives until 1860, of course, counting as non-people. They were not in that census. Taking the land away from the Indians became a major motive. And you can write European philosophers of how, among them John Locke, of how it is justified to take land away from people who do not even know how to effectively use it. So you are justified if you just take it away. And in Ben Kiernan's book on, it's called Blood and Soil, it's a comparative study of genocides across history. There are multiple quotes to that effect from among the best and enlightened men of that time. This then rapidly led into the proper American period of destroying the Native American community on what had become US territory, with the accompanying campaigns of ethnic cleansing and genocide such as the Trail of Tears, the Sand Creek Massacre, the massacre at Wounded Knee in today's Pine Ridge Reservation, and many, many, many more. A particularly nasty episode is the protracted but very little known genocide of many of the Californian Indians. In California, as late as in the 19th century, the native population collapsed from 250,000 in 1800 to 18,000 in 1890. As the immune system of the natives had a long time to adapt to the challenges posed by the brought-in diseases at that time, it's very unlikely that the latter played a major role in this collapse. And indeed, Russell Thornton approvingly quotes an earlier researcher to the effect, and I quote, "In California, the enormous decrease from about 250,000 to less than 220,000 is due chiefly to the cruelties and the wholesale massacres perpetrated by the miners and early settlers." The reference to the miners is mainly, but not exclusively, to the infamous Californian gold rush, which is romanticized in many films. I could add here evidence from Stannard that all of this was accompanied by an abominable and ultra-racist campaign, in part emanating from the Californian government itself. A large part of the collapse of the Native American population in the US in the 19th century happened right there, in California and southern Oregon. 400 years after the beginning of the conquest of the Americas, the native population in what was now the United States had reached an all-time low. So, and here you can see how it goes from east to west. It starts with ethnic cleansing, is interspersed with real genocides of tribes and nations and little populations, and it ends up with the big, once again, big genocide in California. But miraculously, as you also see from the graph in Russell Thornton's book, the low point turned out to be a turnaround. There are now 10 times as many Native Americans in the US than there were in 1892. So this tremendously sad story is also a story of resistance, resilience, and hope. And the same is true south of the Rio Grande and north of the Canadian border. After a hard and shaky start I had with all this difficult material, which is not only sad, but well, so much is still uncertain. It's of course tempting to go on and on, but we have to resist that temptation. And I think this turning point is actually a really good point to stop. I know that not everyone likes the Indian author Sherman Alexie, but I do, because for me he was an eye-opener. And that's why I would like at the end to quote from his fantastic book, Reservation Blues. Big Mom told them a new song, the Shadow Horses song, the Slaughtered Horses song, the Screaming Horses song, a song of mourning that would become a song of celebration. We have survived, we have survived.